Millions of people displaced by Boko Haram's violence in Nigeria and surrounding states are now in desperate need. How bad is the humanitarian crisis? Hello, I'm Etah Ewane, and this is The Heat. Over the last 7 years, the radical group Boko Haram has fought a war that has left thousands of people dead, mainly in northern Nigeria. But the conflict has also spread to the neighboring countries of Chad, Cameroon and Niger. Millions have been displaced and many are now seeking refuge in the Lake Chad basin. They are in dire need of food and children are dying from malnutrition and disease. It is a massive humanitarian crisis. We begin with our correspondent, Sophie Adengo, who joins us from the Nigerian capital, Abuja. And Sophie, the violence caused by Boko Haram is responsible for driving so many of these displaced people to the Lake Chad basin area. Can you tell us more about how this crisis developed?
Well, the Nigerian government really began to see a consolidation of the group in 2009, and after their leader or spiritual guide, Mohammed Yusuf, died in 2012, you see a more radicalized, a more vocal and more violent Boko Haram under the leadership of Abubakar systematically raiding villages and causing carnage in much of Nigeria's northeast, and of course trickling down here to the capital of the country. And it's in villages like Mubi and Baga where massive massacres were recorded that the Nigerian government really began to recognize the dangers that were lurking behind this now terrorist group. And of course, coupled with the kidnapping of 276 girls from a local school in Chibok, really culminated in the drastic generation of these displacement populations into neighboring states like Yobe and Adamawa, but also across borders into Cameroon and Chad and Niger. And, you know, it's this systematic movement of people and really coming to terms with how to handle these populations in terms of feeding and providing sanitary care and health that has really generated what some UN organizations are calling the worst humanitarian crisis. Anan.
Any idea of how many people have been displaced? And you talk about the humanitarian crisis. How bad is it?
Well, the humanitarian crisis, as it's now being called, is really unfolding even as we speak. We now see populations of almost 2 million displaced in northern Nigeria, but also in the far Cameroon part of Cameroon, you see large numbers there, as well as an area known as Lok in Chad and an area south of Niger known as Difa. And the population differs really, but ideally aid agencies are looking at a number of almost 9 million people. And as we go forward into the next year, you know, food insecurities, cases of acute malnutrition are surfacing, and a lot of these aid agencies scaling up their operations in this geographical zone to really try and cope with these numbers that seem to be growing. And these refugee outflows are being discovered nearly every single day. Anan.
And what's the latest on the fight against Boko Haram? Has there been much progress? Is there any end in sight to the violence?
Well, the Nigerian government has embarked on a campaign, what they are calling Operation Lafiya-Dolo, which loosely translates into a sort of peace by force, you know, coalition with the rest of the neighboring countries like Chad, Niger, and Cameroon in really, you know, solidifying a group that will confront Boko Haram in a counterterrorism strategy, but also stressing that in a special situation like this one, sovereignty will take a backseat, and instead these countries will work together in providing, you know, a general peace, you know, unit that will directly be dealing with Boko Haram. The upside is that, you know, according to many of these watchdog groups that really watch terror groups like Boko Haram, there has been a significant registering of 30% less deaths that are attributed directly to Boko Haram. However, there is this spillage of Boko Haram into these neighboring countries that has seen considerable violence from the group, and it's hoped that the Nigerian government is addressing this need of protecting not only its sovereign state, but also the neighboring countries that are affected. Anan.
Thanks, Sophia. That's CCTV correspondent Sophia Adengo reporting from Abuja in Nigeria. And joining me now from the United Nations is Stephen O'Brien. He is the Under-Secretary General and Emergency Relief Coordinator at the UN. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Hello.
Put this crisis in some kind of perspective for us. How big is it?
Well, it's huge, and it's been growing, and very, very rapidly. For a good period of time, well over a year, I and other colleagues in the United Nations, but particularly as the Emergency Relief Coordinator and as Under-Secretary in charge of Humanitarian Affairs, I have been raising the issue about the massive growing humanitarian needs in particularly the Lake Chad basin and northeastern Nigeria, centered around Maiduguri and that area in Borno State, where Boko Haram has been wreaking its heinous fighting and oppression of people for so long. And now that the security situation has been being able to push back some of the Boko Haram, albeit there continues to be very intense fighting and security worries, and there has been back and forth, nonetheless, both with the flight of people across borders and internally displaced, and the very severe pressure this has put upon food supplies, access to medical care, and access for women and children in particular for their protection, we have seen an escalating amount of need. And in particular, when you ask me about the size, when I look at the 4 countries affected, so we have primarily northeastern Nigeria, but also Niger, Cameroon and Chad, and they all have hundreds of thousands of people and millions of people who are now both in real peril and real risk and have been continuing to do so. In particular, we have about 16.2 million people. This is double from when I was talking about this only 3 or 4 months ago, who are now at risk, of whom about 14 million are in northeastern Nigeria alone. And there is an increasing recognition by the federal government of Nigeria, who have put together an interministerial task team in order to try and meet the coordinated needs with the government of Nigeria, for us as the United Nations and all our implementing agencies and partners, particularly the World Food Programme and UNICEF focused on children, that we are now really scaling up, and huge numbers of people are being reached in terms of their needs. 3 million out of that 14 million in northeastern Nigeria so far being met. But that is clearly inadequate, clearly insufficient. And in particular, when you look at the 14 million, 7.7 million, that's over half, are in severe malnutrition, many of whom are children. And we are reaching as many as we can. But at the moment, for the appeals that we've put out, the financial appeals, the money, the cash that buys the programs, that we can have our brave aid workers out there reaching the people, is only 39% funded. So that means that we're short of $6 out of every 10 that we need in order to be able to scale up to meet the huge, massive scale, as you rightly hinted in your opening question.
You talk about children. They must be the most vulnerable in this crisis. What can you tell us about their plight?
Well, children, yes, certainly are the most vulnerable, because of course you've got to remember, when you have malnutrition, not only do children suffer most quickly, most severely, but of course it leaves long-lasting effects, whether it's stunting or their development, which it's almost impossible ever to recover. But we need very rapidly to get the very high energy, high protein foods into them in order to help them recover. And whether this is in Diffa, that's in Niger, where I was in May, June this year, where the needs have doubled. We've got many, many people fleeing from northeastern Nigeria across what is only effectively a dried up stream bed into that part of southeastern Niger. And there the children and the women, and indeed many of the elderly, some of the chronically sick, are all in dire need of support in a country which is very, very willing and coordinated and cooperating with the international community. But Niger has already very severe chronic issues for malnutrition, for the support needed for WASH, that's water and sanitation and hygiene, and for medical access. And that's reaching something in the region of a million people. Then go to northeastern Nigeria again. And children, of course, their protection is absolutely vital. When you have so many stories, not least you'll be well aware of the Chibok girls, where they have been held against their will and many would argue brainwashed into now being part of what Boko Haram have sequestered them, and the abuse and the terrible treatment that has been heaped out on those girls, on all the other women and children, and indeed some young boys and young men who've been forced to be fighters against their will. And so these are the protection issues, in addition simply to the life-saving, life-supporting issues, such as food, water, access to medicines, which also we're doing everything we can to scale up and to meet those needs.
Now, you're describing a crisis there of major proportions. Are you, as the UN's man in charge of relief coordination, prioritizing what you need? Is it more personnel, more money, more aid, or a combination of all of these things?
Well, of course, the answer to that is, I'm afraid, it is all these things. But yes, we have to prioritize. We have no choice. The world has got many crises around. We can't put ourselves into a competition with other crises where human suffering takes place. It is our job as world citizens, as the United Nations, impartially, independently, at all times, completely neutrally, to meet those needs, irrespective of how they have arisen, who has the needs, and where they are. And at any time, we demand safe, unimpeded access. These are the humanitarian principles which the world signed up to. And under international humanitarian law, we absolutely need to work, particularly with the governments where we can. And as I say, the federal government of Nigeria and the local governor of Borno State and the other neighboring states, Adamawa and Gombe, and in all the other neighboring states of northeastern Nigeria, we're working with the local governments in order to have the access that we need, unimpeded, and we need to make sure that we keep a distinction in order to protect the very brave and determined, committed aid workers at some distance from the security forces. That's always necessary in order to ensure protection of the aid workers. But above all, we need to prioritize getting food to meet the severe malnutrition issues for children and all those who are chronically in need of energy and high-protein foods to help them recover from what otherwise is a life-threatening condition. We need to make sure they have access to water, although that's slightly easier in these conditions, although by no means guaranteed, particularly for drinking water that's not going to carry communicable and infectious disease. And waterborne diseases, as you know, is one of the most debilitating things that happens in a crisis.
Right.
But also particularly access to healthcare. So yes, prioritization, particularly through the World Food Programme and through UNICEF, and the coordination of that is absolutely vital. And it's very interesting to see how some international and local NGOs have also been able, after we've been calling this and we've got our people mobilized and moving in, have been able also to confirm in certain particular localities the depth of crisis that we're facing, and are also able to contribute their complementary support for all that we're doing. So I'm pleased that coordination is really taking root.
Okay, Stephen, we're going to have to leave it there. Stephen O'Brien, thanks for joining us. We need to take a short break right now. Much more on this devastating humanitarian crisis when we return. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.